Canada had a defence force in part so the Americans wouldn't do it for you. And what's happened? You've let it atrophy, and now they're wanting to do it for you. You need to have defence against help.
This is the Expert Series podcast from the CDA Institute, Canada's premier defence and security think tank. I'm Josh Malm, and it's Friday, August 8th, 2025.
And today I'm announcing that our government will be working with our long-standing defence and security partners, Australia, to build a new long-range, over-the-horizon military radar system.
With changes in American foreign policy, great power competition, the rise of authoritarian powers, and amid long-standing alliances facing growing uncertainty, some have proposed that Canada diversify its defence relationships beyond its traditional reliance on the United States in the Euro-Atlantic framework. There's been increasing attention paid to like-minded Anglosphere partners like Australia, UK, and New Zealand, or CANZUK, and there's growing speculation about whether an alternative defence alignment might be feasible or desirable. Today on the pod, Blaxland and Srdjan Vucetic discuss the feasibility of Canada meaningfully diversifying its defence relationships away from the US and assess whether alternative alignments are realistic. While new defence partnerships may present opportunities for cooperation, structural constraints, geography, and decades of defence integration make a meaningful pivot highly unlikely for Canada. Jonathan Blaxland is a director of the ANU North American Liaison Office and professor of International Security and Intelligence Studies in the Strategic and Defense Studies Center at the Coral Bell School of Asia-Pacific Affairs. Srdjan Vucetic is a professor at the Graduate School of Public and International Affairs. This is the Expert Series.
CANZUK is not yet a serious government policy idea. So we're talking in the abstract here. And with this caveat, I would say the main strategic rationale is hedging. Hedging is a pragmatic policy to mitigate risks and maintain fallback options. So the pre-existing alliances and partnerships, such as NATO, NORAD, ANZUK, AUKUS, etc., are now at a risk of extinction. Then it makes sense for four countries, such as Canada, Australia, etc., to think about some new alliances or partnerships. We could call this good realpolitik or prudent strategy, however you want to put it. Now, we're talking, again, in the abstract only. So as someone who likes international relations theory, I would say that CANZUK enthusiasts, they proceed from valid premises. The global power is rapidly shifting. The space for reimagining geopolitics is now more open than at any point since the middle years of the 20th century, probably. And the direction of U.S. politics makes U.S. security and economic relations rather unreliable. We see the global geopolitical strategic context is very, very different. This time, the strategic competition concerns the rise of China, U.S. insularism or imperialism, depending on the context, depending on your preferences, Russia's revanchism, and many other things. So the referent object today is not empire, it's national independence and sovereignty for countries such as Canada, Britain, Australia, and New Zealand. So the stated purpose of CANZUK is to reduce the vulnerabilities of the putative member states vis-a-vis their brooding neighborhoods. So Canada vis-a-vis the United States, UK vis-a-vis the European theater or the EU, if you like, Australia and New Zealand vis-a-vis China and Asia. So if we put this in the language of IR theory, CANZUK provides much needed exit options from three regional hegemonic orders. So Canada and the US are not breaking up in defense and security just yet, and neither are the UK and the EU. In fact, they're going in the opposite direction. Prime Minister Keir Starmer is in negotiations about a new security defense treaty with the European Union. So when advocates talk about a CANZUK defense pact or nuclear deterrent or some kind of energy framework or energy security partnership, they're being charmingly academic, meaning they live in a hypothetical world, right? A formalized defense technology sharing agreement similar to structure of, let's say, AUKUS Pillar 2 is conceivable, in my opinion. Something that can probably happen. We can imagine experts from each nation getting together, focusing on specific domains and functional areas, working on developing and producing next generation military technologies to be used by the armed forces of each of the four countries. This wouldn't be terribly revolutionary, and it could yield some results, and you could argue it could make sense, especially now that the actual AUKUS is about to be reviewed by the U.S. Department of Defense. So there's uncertainty, some kind of CANZUK, Pillar 2 style working groups could make sense. I'm not sure. I'm just putting it out there. Now, we could also say something about the middle power identities of at least three, or let's say two of the four so-called CANZUK countries. They want to maximize security and autonomy at the same time, but it's impossible, certainly for non-great powers, to achieve both goals simultaneously, at least with a single policy. So the basic alliance theory would say that there's a trade-off between security and autonomy, or autonomy erosion, and the purpose is the purpose of good policies to blunt the sharp edges of those trade-offs. And you could say CANZUK as an idea could eventually, approximate such a policy. Again, I'm a little skeptical, but that's the promise behind this entire CANZUK discourse. It's an illusion to think that an alliance with Britain would ever again become Australia's main strategic priority. And so it's similarly an illusion to expect that Canada would rebalance its defense posture away from the Euro-Atlantic, especially in the context of the Ukraine war, and towards the Asia-Pacific, or in this case, actually Australasia, to accommodate something called CANZUK, right? We would be hard-pressed to imagine a scenario in which successive Canadian governments invest in capabilities that allow major rotations of, let's say, submarines, Canadian submarines out of Western Australia, or, Auckland's North Shore, right? That, I think, is an illusion. So it would not fit with Canada's traditional defense posture at all.
Now, considering CANZUK in light of Canada's relationships with traditional allies, could Canadian participation in this CANZUK-style defensive framework we're discussing complicate our balancing act between strong tradition of continental defense with the U.S. and other multilateral engagements we're already taking part in?
Yeah, great question once again. So I mentioned earlier, policymaking is about blunting the sharp edges of various trade-offs. Defense is no different from most other policies, but in many ways is an outstanding case in point. So investing time and energy in exploring military CANZUK options reduces the time and energy that's needed to deal with the U.S. And other allies. So we in Canada share an industrial defense base with the U.S. Pursuing other options may cost Canadian jobs, profits, and taxes. It may even erode some Canadian influence in Washington or some key U.S. states at a time when we really need to have allies south of the border. So there's a risk, right? I recall also that plans for advancing European industrial and financial instruments to support to instruments that would support European defense. So Canada, according to the current government, wants to be part of it in one way or another. But of course, the Europeans will have the same conditions as the Americans have always had, which is that only contract with our arms manufacturers will be financed. And so that would be another major trade-off to think about, which makes me even more skeptical about the CANZUK idea.
I'm curious if you can elaborate a bit further on what's required on Canada's end to be a more credible partner.
Great stuff, and thank you for pushing me on this. I think it's really important. So let me think about it. So there are strategic incentives for Canada to deepen ties with the UK, Australia, and New Zealand, right? I talked about that earlier as a prudent hedging strategy. So that's in the abstract. Now, practical and institutional constraints limit the feasibility of a CANZUK pivot. Canada's foreign and economic policies have been generally oriented towards the North Atlantic, meaning with Europe, with the United States. And this foundation is still there. It influences Canada's policy priorities, even if the shift in global power to China and Asia more generally challenges this traditional orientation, right? It forces us to reevaluate our geopolitical priorities and maybe consider a more balanced approach between the Euro-Atlantic and Indo-Pacific engagements, right? Now, that makes sense. But a deeper defense alignment with the so-called other CANZUK countries would include some kind of cost. So this would require a major rebalancing of defense investments and postures, similar to the, early years of the Cold War. An extreme scenario is Korea, or the Korean War. This was a time when Canada had huge commitments in Europe, but also managed to provide additional 20,000, 25, 6,000 troops to Korea in wartime. So more than 500 Canadians lost their lives. Should be remembered and mentioned in this context. Many of whom are buried there. So at that time, Canadian troops were there, destroyers and aircraft were based in Japan. 7 years, I think it took. And crucially, Canadian military spending peaked at over 7% of GDP. And I mentioned this to emphasize just how defense policy would have to change to fit some of the goals of a hypothetical CANZUK, right? So what if the global situation really changes or darkens or changes for the worse? Well, that's what we're looking at. And this would mean not just the sacrifice of some political taboos at home, but it would mean all sorts of sacrifices, higher taxes, lower living standards, less generous public service, and so on and so forth. You could argue that's already going to happen anyway, but it's just going to be, I think, that much more costly if Canada were to try to rebalance towards the Indo-Pacific because of the two CANZUK allies.
If we could now look at the allies that would make up a proposed CANZUK alliance or cooperative defensive framework, depending on the level of integration this would be taken to, how would you compare their military capabilities and strategic priorities? And is there enough convergence there to justify discussion of a more formalized security alliance?
Great question. Once again, so the strategic priorities, I would say, are different. I mean, I implied that earlier. This should not be surprising. The lack of convergence is also unsurprising, both theoretically and practically. So CANZUK stands for the world's largest landmass, distributed across 3 or 4 continents, depending on how you count New Zealand, divided by huge oceans. So convergence works in legacy alliances because they tend to be in a single region. So, for example, NATO, or in European security, or let's say Scandinavian countries, you can say that the Nordic countries are very good at deterring Russia, partly because of convergence. Norway has an excellent navy, Sweden has an excellent air force, Finland has an excellent army. So the 4 countries that are to 4 CANZUK are nothing like that. In fact, with some exceptions, they happen to be short of the troops, tanks, artillery, munitions, logistics, intelligence, other assets needed for a solid conventional defense. At least 3 out of 4 lack the sufficient air power and long-range weapons needed for effective conventional deterrence, right? So that would be a challenge. And all of this is because all 4 have relied on U.S. logistical and other support for decades, especially Canada, but not just Canada. So this is why CANZUK defense plans can only start with working groups on defense tech, ideally with convincing plans for rearmament over the long term, in my opinion. I mean, it's very hard to talk about any other kind of convergence. And by the way, historically speaking, CANZUK would not be the first time these countries were talking about convergence or rearmament. I mentioned earlier imperial defense. It did not work at the peak of imperial power, and so that should make us skeptical about it working today.
Considering what you've just laid out, can you elaborate a bit further on what a credible path towards military interoperability or defense integration amongst the CANZUK states would look like? And even if not explicitly in the minds of their policymakers in regard specifically to CANZUK formalization, would you say, in light of recent shifts in alliances, particularly considering the US, is there a political appetite for that kind of investment?
Yeah. Okay. That's a big question. Probably the hardest one so far. So I think the jump from working groups on, for example, undersea warfare capabilities or quantum enhanced navigation systems to something like military interoperability or defense integration is simply too big. And it's too big in both practical and political terms. So I'll try to start with the practical. So in defense circles, the word interoperability was, I think, first coined in the 90s. But the idea behind it is much, much older. So in World War II, allies invested in or the allies invested in what we now call interoperability. And people like leaders fought, some of them. Winston Churchill certainly did. But some leaders fought to keep this practice going, even after the war, not least between the American and the British armed forces, but in fact, in what we now call the Five Eyes partnership. And this has succeeded. So since 1945, we have had something called the ABC armies, American, British, and Canadian. And so in 1963, the Australians joined, and then later the Kiwis joined, much later the Kiwis joined. So interoperability is happening with the Americans. And much of it, of course, has depended on U.S. power, meaning its ability and willingness to help its allies in various ways. And this was never altruism. Of course, it was in U.S. interest. And since the so-called CANZUK countries helped out the U.S. politically, diplomatically, and of course militarily for decades, it was a good deal for the U.S., you could argue. Now we have a U.S. with a very different government that may not be interested in these types of cooperative frameworks at all. So CANZUK advocates think that the four hypothetical countries could simply withdraw from these structures and then keep going. But I think this is another illusion. You can achieve small symbolic goals here and there, but you're unlikely to deploy forces together, like I said earlier, or claim some kind of seamless or advanced interoperability, between British and Canadian and Australian and New Zealand armed forces. Now, that's practical issues at the level of operations. When it comes to political appetite, my theory is that support for CANZUK is driven not so much by rational calculus, but by ideological beliefs and emotions, or moral values even. So advocates for the pacts do not primarily persuade followers through logical arguments or appeals to national self-interest or some kind of rational calculus. Instead, they mostly use emotionally charged rhetoric to tap into symbolic predispositions, if you want to call them, to mobilize some kind of support. So that this kind of politics, I think, is sufficient to get some CANZUK ideas off the ground, but not all. Agreeing on a labor mobility program or even a free trade in goods and services is very different from agreeing to pursue a defense alliance or a pact or some kind of partnership. So polling shows that some of these softer CANZUK versions have considerable support in each of the four nations. I tend to believe those polls, actually. But the question is, do political leaders, are they ready to lead on this? So we could assume that some conservative prime ministers, or most conservative prime ministers, both today or in the future, are on board. The challenge then is to persuade the more kind of centrist leaders, such as Carney, such as Albanese, such as Starmer, to co-lead on this issue and then get CANZUK in some forms off the ground. But then even from there, it's still a huge jump to go to CANZUK in defense, or, let's say some folks are advancing the idea of a CANZUK nuclear deterrent. To me, that's blue sky thinking. That's common in university classrooms, but not. I don't think it's gonna reach policy shops in Ottawa, Canberra, Wellington, and London.
We're reaching the end of our questions for today, but as we wrap up, I'm hoping we can touch on how CANZUK fits into the broader geopolitical context of the present day. Could this CANZUK idea gain traction in our increasingly multipolar world by positioning itself as a values-based counterweight to authoritarian alliances such as the one we see rising between Russia, China, and other powers?
Yeah, I mean, it's a great question. As a values-based alliance, even the alliances that we now think of values-based alliances, so NATO, they were full of compromises when it comes to their stated values. Let's say in the Washington Treaty Preamble, there was much discussion about democracy, but not all NATO members were democratic. Many years after the treaty was signed and ratified. So I generally stay away from the values-based discussions, the democracy versus authoritarianism. But of course, it's becoming very hard to ignore it, or to put it aside, or to temporize it, especially at a time when Trump in the United States is going through supporting a wave of domestic repression that now includes elected officials. So the attacks on a senator, the city government of Los Angeles. You can even think of the Soviet-style military parade scheduled tomorrow. So all of these things, of course, are making us think about, okay, the U.S. is fitting with the democratic world less and less. So what could democracies such as Canada do to stay away, or to hedge against authoritarianism? And so geopolitically, it's natural for the orphans of the liberal international order, so to speak, to come together. Now the question is, why CANZUK? Why not simply call it the West minus the United States, or something like that, because there will be demand from allies in, let's say, the Indo-Pacific, Japan and South Korea, to say, well, what about us? Why can't we work on a framework that that's something like NATO plus IP4, the Indo-Pacific 4, so meaning South Korea, Japan, Australia, and New Zealand? Why not maintain some legacy institutions in security and defense that could, in fact, be called value-based, and that they could still respond to, as you said, our increasingly multipolar world in which authoritarian alliances like the Russia-China axis require some sort of balancing.
What are some of the thoughts about the concept of an arrangement like CANZUK in Australia? What is thinking like there? And do you see avenues for further cooperation and collaboration between countries like Canada, Australia, but some of the other hypothetical allies within that arrangement?
Yeah, so CANZUK, it's an interesting concept that has, historical roots that we thought were long past, but which have seen a resurgence in interest largely because of the great, the poly crisis, if you like, the multifaceted set of challenges we're facing, in which the CANZUK countries are looking to have a little bit more agency than that had, and to be fair, I think because of the disruption in the US, the sense that the United States is taking on a more transactional approach to relations, and arguably retreating from ideational leadership. This apparent transactional retreat from ideational leadership is leaving the space for the CANZUK countries to swap notes more than ever. And that's reinforced very much by Brexit. Brexit, which saw Britain look to reburnish ties with its old Anglosphere allies in a way that it didn't worry about in the 70s, 80s and 90s. Let's not forget, they joined the European Economic Community at a time when it seemed like their world was just in Europe and that empire of old was to be walked away from. And economically, that left New Zealand particularly exposed because New Zealand was still heavily dependent on trade with Britain. Australia less so because we had started to diversify, although it still took a hit. Canada, of course, was much more already oriented towards the United States. But its position is kind of those positions which have been pretty well rock solid for a generation or more now are very much in question today. And the election of Mark Carney in Canada, the re-election of Anthony Albanese in Australia, suggest that there's a different dynamic at play, which does open up space for CANZUK. It's important to, I think, recognise nonetheless the limitations of options, because these four countries, we're all in different parts of the globe. We have different economic and security interests. There's overlaps. There's still considerable overlaps. But there's a limit to how far you can push them, And so we're seeing Australia and New Zealand, a considerable overlap, a resurgence in enthusiasm for collaboration between Australia and New Zealand, reflective of the more conservative political orientation of the current government in New Zealand, in Wellington. But it's not necessarily likely to, not necessarily a bipartisan enthusiasm, particularly on the security front. Economically, there's a recognition of long-standing recognition of closer economic relations between Australia and New Zealand, but security-wise, it's not necessarily bipartisan. So, AUKUS, so many layers here where CANZUK kind of overlaps partially, if not completely. So, five-power defence arrangement. Australia, New Zealand, UK are in a five-way partnership with Malaysia and Singapore, an arrangement that is really about providing security for Malaysia and Singapore, but it's anachronistic in a sense, but it is actually still very much appreciated. AUKUS has the UK, Australia, the United States, not Canada and New Zealand, and news today, Elbridge Colby, the Deputy Secretary of Defence, is undertaking a review of AUKUS. So that's up for review, which is generating a degree of unease and, consternation about people who have invested enormously in the AUKUS arrangement, particularly the US, the Brits and the Australians, but most exposed at the moment, of course, is Australia. So that, I think, is driving some impetus for these countries to collaborate. Now, they've been collaborating informally for a long time anyway. I mean, let's face it, the very term the Five Eyes was hush-hush until not that long ago. When I was a young analyst, it was talked about in hushed terms. Nowadays, everybody does Five Eyes: police, border security, immigration, intel, in Navy, Air Force, cyber, space. You name the domain. There's a Five Eyes entity related to it. In that context, the CANZUK countries have always swapped notes informally, if not formally, and have done so for generations. So, that has been happening anyway in terms of techniques, procedures, standards, compatibility of equipment. One New Zealand officer who I served with on operations in East Timor, he went on to become the ambassador to Indonesia, Kevin Burnett. He made the point to me that interoperability, it's particularly Australia and New Zealand interoperability. We're talking about how well we were able to interact in East Timor. In East Timor was the first time we had, in a long time, we'd had, actually I think since the Korean War, that we'd had a brigade with a Kiwi battalion, a Canadian company, two Australian battalions, and some US human teams. So the Five Eyes were there, and we had some Irish as well. So the Irish, the other English speakers who aren't part of the Five Eyes, who've kind of opted out of NATO and other things, were there for the East Timor crisis. So it was an interesting experience. But he was saying, Kevin Burnett was saying, the interoperability it's not so much a technical thing. He said it's between the ears. It's a cultural predisposition. I wrote a book called Strategic Cousins, comparing and contrasting Australia's and Canada's military experience in the 20th centuries, from the Anglo-Boer War to the start of the War on Terror. And I make the point that we have an enormous commonality that we actually don't recognize all the time. And I say we're strategic cousins, even though for the last half century, if not longer, Britain has kind of distanced itself from the Antipodeans, if not the Canadians. The Canadians are keeping the British force through NATO and through the training facilities that are shared inside Canada with British forces rotating through there, have maintained a connection that wasn't quite so close with Australia and New Zealand until the last 2 decades of fighting alongside each other in Iraq and Afghanistan, where we saw a reburnishing of connections of personal connections between these partner nations that we kind of had a fresh perspective on how much we have in common, how similar we actually are, and the utility therefore of kind of thinking about working together. And I think that's the context in which CANZUK has emerged.
Well, thanks for that overview, John. Our engagement within our military footprint in the Indo-Pacific is modest at best. Do you see any room for countries like Canada, Australia, New Zealand, and the UK to collaborate more on issues central to that region?
So, yeah, there's enormous prospects for enhanced collaboration. We've struggled with parochial defence industrial policies. We're both signed contracts for BAE derived, Type 26 derived, surface warships, and yet we're not going with the same systems. We're not sharing the load. We're kind of doing it on our own. It's like, really, could we not have coordinated that a bit better? We've got very parochial defence industrial policies that have generated in Australia's case and Canada's case incredibly inefficient defence industries that have, the bang for the buck is really bad, really poor when it comes to the cost benefits ratio of the purchase of warships. So we have a track record, Canada does too, I'm pretty sure, of never being quite satisfied with just something, a design off the shelf. We always feel we have to modify it a gazillion different ways, and each single modification dramatically increases the cost. So you get this, super sharp, very impressive piece of kit, but you only get onesies and twosies of it because you can't afford more, right? Rather than actually going for something that's going to roughly do the job and get them in quantity. And of course, in conflict, as you know, quantity has a quality all its own. And we, both Canada and Australia and New Zealand, much more so, we've got boutique defence forces structured for the unipolar moment, and that moment is well and truly past. So yes, there's collaboration we can do, but let's not kid ourselves. We're both actually from a very low base in terms of numbers, with quantity being the measure. We do not have the quantity. We do not have the critical mass. I like to say in Australia, we've got a one-punch defence force. It's non-structured for a serious stoush. It's structured for peacekeeping and structured for, local, I was involved in the East Timor intervention in 1999. That was a kind of high point in terms of capability, getting the Australian services to collaborate as part of the Joint Defence Force to deliver an effect for the Australian government and for the international community. We could barely get ourselves there. We had a 22-nation coalition, grateful support from Canada with the Navy, Air Force, and land forces with the Bandus coming to help out. But from a very small base, right? And that was a high point. We're not anywhere near that today. We talk about replacing like for like. We're not seriously talking about expansion, even though there are countries, and clearly China's the lead one, but it's not the only one, that are dramatically expanding their military capabilities. And we are largely sitting on our hands. We talk the good talk, but we don't walk it very well yet. And that's generating considerable concern. And a lot of pundits in Australia now talking about the need to seriously muscle up in the near term, not the long term.
I do know that earlier this year, Canada announced that it would be purchasing an over-the-horizon radar system for NORAD from an Australian company. I do know last year there was a joint statement on Canada-Australia partnership on emerging missile defense research. Do you see any more avenues to learn from each other and cooperate in terms of interoperability and defense initiatives here?
Yeah, sure. And I mean, the joint Genderly Operational Radar Network, JORN, it's world class. So it's a great arrangement for Australia and Canada to collaborate on that. We both have similar challenges of a largely empty norths, requiring clever, sophisticated, wide area surveillance systems to help us stay across security challenges in our largely empty northern half of our territory. So there's similar, quite parallel phenomena there. And there's no question that the algorithms will have to get adjusted because the geography, the atmospherics will be different. But the foundational technological underpinnings are really robust and have been well tested and are pretty mature in the Australian case. So that's great. Clearly, when we look at expanding our capabilities, when we look at, you're getting frigates, getting submarines, we're mad not to look more closely at how we can stop being parochial about being made in Canada or made in Australia, and think about how we can do this more effectively with the long term in mind. Because we're dealing with the tyranny of the political system we have, where everyone's working to short-term political cycles, and very few leaders are prepared to kind of rise above it and think long-term, intergenerationally about how we position ourselves for the future. But the Type 26 decisions, for instance, why on earth we're not really collaborating very, very closely on that, it just baffles me. Similarly, on submarines, why is it that Canada is going to go down another diesel-electric path for submarines when 40 years ago it was self-evident to naval policymakers that you wanted to go nuclear propulsion? Now, from my point of view, nuclear propulsion is critical. Now, there's a big review just been initiated here in the United States about AUKUS. For Australia, it's really important, I would contend. And here's the 4 reasons. One is almost saturation LEO satellite coverage by China, coupled with decades of pattern analysis for how we use our submarines and when they come up to recharge their batteries, coupled with artificial intelligence and armed drones. Nowadays, when you come up to recharge your battery, to snorkel, to turn on your diesel engines and turn on the exhaust and suck in fresh air, the wake of the funnel is now detectable from above. So the only advantage of a submarine is stealth. If you're no longer stealthy, you might as well pack up and go home. Now, for Australia, to get from Perth to any other capital city, you have to recharge your batteries about a dozen times. Just say Perth to Darwin, Perth to Melbourne, any of those multiple exposures to detection. So for us, the only way to stay stealthy is to stay underwater. And the only way to do that over long distances is nuclear propulsion. Now people say, oh, but John, you're going to use that to apply, going to the South China Sea. Our submarines have always been going to the South China Sea. That's nothing new. I mean, the argument that is some kind of reason why we shouldn't do it. It's just clearly people are speaking through their hats. People are speaking on this topic who are incredibly uninformed about how Australia's operated in the past and how we would do it. But the other point is, just to get around Australia, you need to be able to operate at distance. Now, I would contend that applies to Canada as well, particularly when you think about the growing challenge of the Arctic. You need to be able to get there quick. You need to be able to do it stealthily. Why is this even a debate? When 40 years ago you all agreed, before the end of the Cold War, and it was only because the Cold War was coming to an end and it looked so expensive that the decision was made not to do it. Today, I would contend, as particularly, here's this thing. What is defence against help? Now, this is this great theory. When I was doing my PhD in Canada, it was very clear to me that Canada had a defence force in part so the Americans wouldn't do it for you. And what's happened? You've let it atrophy, and now they're wanting to do it for you. You need to have defence against help. And part of that means muscling up big time. And part of that means having capabilities that are serious. And for a big country like Canada, like a big country like Australia, diesel electrics don't cut it.
I feel like we just started kind of getting deeper into the discussion, but I will have to wrap up in a few minutes. I'm wondering if to kind of pull things together, if maybe in 1 or 2 minutes you might be able to summarize your kind of general views on CANZUK again. Is it to remain a kind of hypothetical arrangement in the ether, or could it actually come to fruition? And if not, could you actually maybe see further integration between our countries a little down the road?
Yeah, so it's a great one. So there's a parallel phenomenon with people talking about an Asian NATO. I just don't know that there's a huge amount of additional benefit to be gained from formalizing what is already happening informally. Our 4 nations collaborate extensively on a range of fronts that most pundits do not have much of a clue about. CANZUK, it's kind of informally already happening, on the sidelines of just about every international fora. The Kiwis, the Aussies, the Canucks, and sometimes the Brits will get along and they'll rub each other's shoulders and, nudge, nudge, wink, wink, share a drink and have a bit of a snigger about, someone else in the room. That's what we do, right? So do we need to do it? I would contend, look, it's good to talk about. I don't know that there's a huge amount to be gained. For Australia, we need to be working on our relationship with Southeast Asia and the Pacific. Where Canada can help we've talked about some of that, but for us, the focus has got to be on Southeast Asia and the Pacific. That's where we're facing what I'm calling unrestricted competition. Riffing off that book by the 2 Chinese colonels, Unrestricted Warfare, legal, media, psychological, economic, and technological competition, the likes of which we've never seen before. It's game on. And for us, engaging with Southeast Asia and engaging with the Pacific is taking up most of the bandwidth. CANZUK may well just kind of push us over the limit.
And that's all for today's episode. The Expert Series is released every Tuesday and Thursday, but we'll be taking a bit of a break this summer and releasing one podcast a week. If you want to learn more about the CDA Institute, follow us on social media, visit our website at cdainstitute.ca, or subscribe to our newsletter for the latest updates on Canadian defense and international security. If you have comments or feedback about what you heard in today's edition, email josh@cdainstitute.ca. I'm Josh Malm. Until next time.